Hello there, I'm Clyde. I suppose you found your way back to me, or maybe you're just tuning in for the very first time. Either way, I'm glad you're here, wherever here is. Tonight's adventure is a quiet one, a slow one, a gentle little detour in a clock shop tucked away on a side street in Prague. There's nothing to solve, and certainly nothing to rush. Just the soft ticking of time all around. Before we begin, go ahead and settle in. Let your body get heavy, your thoughts grow slow, and if you haven't already, tap that like button and subscribe to follow me wherever I may drift off next. It helps keep these sleepy journeys going. And now, let's step inside, shall we? There's a certain kind of door that doesn't creak exactly. It sighs, a tired wooden exhale, long and low, as if it's seen too many people come and go and has decided not to be dramatic about any of them. That's the sort of door I pushed open when I stumbled upon the clock shop in Prague. It wasn't in a touristy part of town, though I wouldn't know where that was. I hadn't planned to be in Prague at all, to be honest. But the cobblestones under my feet had gently steered me down alley after alley, past flower carts and crumbling archways, until I reached a quiet little square where time felt as if it had stopped paying attention. That door, painted a fading shade of oxblood red, looked like it hadn't been repainted in decades. Tiny hairline cracks ran down its surface like the veins on a maple leaf. I touched the handle, a round, cool brass thing worn smooth at the edges, and the sigh followed. Inside, it was dim, but not dark. Just enough light to make everything feel ambered. The kind of light that makes even the dust look poetic, catching in slow, spiraling patterns as it drifted through sunbeams cast by the high, slender windows. And then came the ticking. Not a single tick, not even a dozen. Hundreds. A layered, staggering chorus of timekeeping in every register you can imagine. Some sharp and crisp, like a metronome. Others low and muffled, like a heartbeat behind a wall. I didn't try to count them all. Not at first. I just stood still and let the sound wrap around me. It was oddly comforting, like rainfall in a forest, where no two drops hit the same leaf. Somewhere to my left, a grandfather clock gave a soft chime, only once, as if to politely note the hour without making a fuss. A few cuckoos coughed quietly but didn't emerge. The room was filled with clocks of every size, style, and century, and somehow they were all wrong and right at the same time. None were perfectly in sync, yet none seemed to mind. I stepped in further, my footfall soft on the worn rug that led deeper into the shop. It smelled like old paper and cedar wood, with a faint whisper of machine oil. There was something timeless about it in the literal sense. Time was everywhere, and yet it felt suspended, like it had taken its coat off and sat down for a rest. At the far end of the room, beyond a jungle of ticking things, I saw a velvet armchair, and that's when I knew I wasn't leaving anytime soon. It took me a while to reach the chair, not because it was far, just because I kept stopping. There was so much to see, so much to hear, and even more to feel in the quiet, invisible spaces between the ticks. Every few steps brought a new sound, another rhythm, a soft talk behind glass, a distant chime that faded into wood. One little clock gave off a faint rattle with each swing of its pendulum, like a nervous breath trying not to be noticed. I paused beside a tall, thin grandfather clock. Its face was pale, almost ivory, with Roman numerals that looked hand-painted and ever so slightly uneven. Its pendulum moved slower than the others, dragging time behind it like a heavy coat. Next to it sat a shelf of pocket watches, each one cradled in its own tiny velvet nest. Some were open, their faces proudly exposed, ticking away with tiny, insistent voices. Others were closed like sleeping oysters, hiding their pearls from the world. The gold ones gleamed under a shaft of dusty light that spilled in through a narrow window above. But it was the tarnished ones that caught my eye, the worn silver, the brass turned to bronze with age. I imagined their previous owners, a railway conductor pacing a platform, a school teacher checking the time between lessons, maybe even a soldier holding on to his last minute before stepping into something uncertain. I stood there longer than I meant to. Then came the little desk clock, the one with the stuck minute hand. It had landed precisely between two numbers and couldn't quite decide which way to go. It wobbled slightly, as though caught in a quiet argument with itself. I knew the feeling. Sometimes I stand still too long in shop aisles trying to pick the right tea. Eventually, I reached the chair. It was tucked into a soft little pool of light, surrounded on three sides by bookshelves and clock cabinets. The air around it felt warmer, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the sunlight. Maybe it was the fabric. Maybe it was just the sense that this was a spot where people sat and stayed. The chair was a deep burgundy, the kind of color that made you think of old theaters and long conversations. The fabric was worn thin at the arms. A single thread curled up from one seam, like a question left unanswered. It had one leg slightly shorter than the others, but someone, long ago probably, had tucked a folded piece of newspaper under it to keep things even. That paper was brittle now. Yellowed. I resisted the urge to peek at the date. I lowered myself into the chair slowly, let it take my weight like an old friend settling in for a long talk. It gave a quiet groan, a creak that wasn't unhappy, just tired, like me. And then I just sat. No phone, no book, no plan. Just the sound. Tick, tick, tock, tick. It wasn't a rhythm exactly. More like a conversation. Hundreds of small voices, each telling their version of the same story. Some fast, some lazy, some stuttering. A chorus of contradictions, and yet somehow it all made sense. Time, layered on time. The clocks didn't agree with each other, but they weren't arguing. They were simply existing, each in their own particular now. I leaned my head back and stared up. The ceiling was high, beamed with wood that had gone soft and dark over the years. In one corner, I noticed a water stain in the vague shape of a rabbit. Its ears were long, its face concerned. I named him Gerald. He seemed like a Gerald. The smell of the place deepened the longer I sat. Cedar, varnish, old wool. Something faintly metallic, and something else. Something sweet, like dried orange peel tucked in a drawer. The light shifted slowly, painting golden stripes across the floorboards. Dust floated through it in lazy spirals, each speck dancing in its own time. I noticed the fabric of the chair beneath me had a tiny patch, carefully stitched by someone who clearly took their time. The kind of repair that wasn't meant to hide the damage, but to honor the object. Somewhere nearby, a soft chime rang out. Just one note. Not high or low, just kind, as if it were gently checking in to see how I was doing. I didn't answer. Didn't need to. I was still. I was listening, and the clocks were glad for it. I must have sat in that chair for a very long time, or maybe it wasn't long at all. It's hard to say, surrounded by clocks that each believed something different. One ticked confidently, like it knew what it was doing. Another hesitated between each second, as though it needed permission. And then there were a few that didn't tick at all. They hummed or clicked or sighed, but none of them agreed. And somehow, that felt honest. It was the light that finally pulled me back from wherever I had drifted off to. It had shifted again, lower now, softer. The kind of light that only comes in late afternoon, when shadows start getting long and everything starts to glow a little at the edges. I blinked a few times, adjusted in the chair, and that's when I noticed him. An old man. He hadn't made a sound. Not a footstep, not a cough, just appeared. Or maybe he'd been there the whole time and I'd only now tuned into him. He was round around the edges, with a small belly that pressed gently against his vest. His hair was a faded silver, not neatly combed but not unruly either. It had the look of someone who had stopped fussing with things a long time ago. His sleeves were rolled up past the elbow and his hands were busy, slow and methodical, with the calm confidence of someone who's done this every day for 50 years. He didn't speak. He looked at me, nodded once. I nodded back. That was it. He sat on a low stool beside a narrow workbench, barely more than a shelf, really. On the table sat a brass carriage clock, squat and square with etched sides and a little handle on top like a lunch pail. He began to polish it with a cloth that looked older than I was. He didn't rush. Just slow, careful circles. A bit of breath to fog the glass. A soft murmur in the back of his throat. Something between a hum and a sigh. I watched. He didn't seem to mind. It was the kind of moment that didn't require conversation. Words would have been loud, awkward, pointless. So we just shared space, him with his cloth, me with my stillness. A cuckoo clock behind me gave the tiniest chirp, just one, before thinking better of it. Far off, another chime rang the quarter hour, or maybe the half. Hard to tell with so many possibilities in the room. The man tilted the clock, examined it from another angle. He tapped one corner gently, as if asking it a question, then nodded as if satisfied with the answer. I closed my eyes again for just a moment. When I opened them, he was gone. No footsteps, no rustle of clothing, no creak of a stool. Only the brass clock remained, sitting now on a higher shelf, looking brighter than before. It gleamed gently in the afternoon light, as if proud to be seen again. I stood slowly, careful not to disturb the spell the chair had cast. It groaned again under my weight, this time a little louder. A parting thought, and then I wandered. Not far, just a few steps, toward a cluster of tall clocks nestled like trees in a quiet grove. The ticking grew thinner, softer, more delicate, like whispers in a library. I didn't know where the old man had gone, or whether he'd ever really been there, but I knew this. I wasn't the only one who had ever come here to listen, and I wouldn't be the last. There's a difference between wandering and leaving. Wandering still belongs to a place. Leaving does not. I wasn't ready to leave, not even close, but I was definitely wandering. I moved beyond the cozy little corner where the chair sat and found myself in a much narrower part of the shop. It wasn't a hallway, not exactly. More like a passage formed by tall cases and leaning shelves, as if the clocks themselves had created a path for me to follow. An aisle made of time. The light dimmed here. Not dark, but dusky, like the edge of evening had settled in without telling anyone. I passed a tall case clock with no hands. No face either. Just the frame, standing with dignity in the gloom. Its glass was fogged slightly, like someone had once breathed on it and walked away. And yet I felt no sadness from it, only peace. It wasn't keeping time anymore, and it didn't seem to mind. Further down, hanging from thin hooks, were rows and rows of cuckoo clocks. Their carved wooden faces stared silently forward. Little houses with doors that didn't open, trees that didn't sway, and birds that stayed tucked away inside. I stopped in front of one shaped like a tiny forest cottage. The hands were frozen at 11:56, the kind of hour where something always feels like it's about to happen, but nothing did. And that was fine. There was something incredibly soothing about how little the clocks cared about each other. Each ticked in its own rhythm, or not at all. A few had settled into a kind of nap, gears resting, weights lowered like they'd finally been allowed to sleep after years of duty. I reached out to steady myself against a nearby shelf. The wood was warm. Not from heat exactly, but from memory. From hands that had brushed it, dusted it, leaned against it while waiting for nothing in particular. Maybe waiting for a moment like this one. I glanced up and spotted a tiny, birdcage-shaped clock nestled high on a ledge above me. No numbers. Just two tiny hands floating above a silver wheel that turned slowly, silently. It was beautiful in the way that only useless things can be. Entirely unnecessary, and yet perfect. Time stretched out here. Not forward, not backward, just outward. Like breath held in the lungs before exhale. I looked down again and saw a child's clock resting on a nearby table. It had a painted moon that rotated across the dial, surrounded by tiny stars that had mostly faded. One of them, right near the top, was in the shape of a heart. It ticked unevenly, like a skipping stone. I watched it until I forgot I was watching it. Then wandered on, deeper into the hush. Soon I came to a velvet curtain, a thick one, dark green with a faint gold trim around the hem. It hung perfectly still, though the air felt different on the other side. I paused, not because I was afraid to pass through it, but because I wanted to linger in this moment, the moment before the next one. Curtains are funny things. They always feel like endings, or beginnings, sometimes both. I took one small step forward. The fabric brushed against my sleeve, cool, soft and heavy like an old coat. It swung just slightly as I passed through, parting slowly, then returning to stillness behind me. And just like that, I was somewhere new. On the other side of the curtain, the world changed. Just a little. The sound was the first thing I noticed. The ticking wasn't gone, but it was muffled now, subdued, as if someone had laid a thick blanket over time itself. There was a hum here, a soft, delicate whirring. Not mechanical exactly, not cold or clinical, but something gentler, like a cat's purr, or the distant vibration of stringed instruments left alone in a quiet room. The lighting in this room was different too. Where the main shop was lit by afternoon sun and wide, sleepy windows, this space seemed to glow from within. Small sconces on the walls gave off a warm, golden hue, like candlelight that had made peace with electricity. The air felt heavier, but in a comforting way, like the hush inside a library or the moment just before a snowfall begins. There were fewer clocks here, and the ones that remained looked stranger. Not broken, not even old, just uninterested in telling time in any ordinary sense. One looked like a glass teardrop filled with tiny metal beads that trickled up instead of down. Another had no face at all, just a polished wooden box with a small brass needle that rotated slowly in uneven arcs, and one clock near the back pulsed, not ticked, pulsed, like a breath. I wandered slowly between them, trailing one hand lightly over a low cabinet as I passed. The wood was smooth and cool and impossibly clean, like it had been cared for by someone who didn't just polish things, but loved them. In the far corner, I saw something unexpected. A mirror. It was tucked between two shelves and hung just above eye level. The frame was walnut, carved with a looping pattern that reminded me of vines or maybe waves. The glass itself was old, not cracked, but wavy, like looking into a reflection that had gone soft with time. I moved closer, hesitant. I didn't see myself right away. The light bent in strange ways. But then, There I was. Only not quite. My face looked slightly behind where it should have been, like my reflection was still catching up to me, or maybe I was catching up to it. I tilted my head slowly. So did it. I smiled. It smiled. But the eyes, they were so calm, so still. I stared for a while, and then a while longer, not out of vanity, not to check how I looked, but because I didn't want to look away. The hum in the room deepened as I stood there. Not louder, just more noticeable. A gentle vibration beneath my feet, in my chest, in my thoughts. It was almost like the room was alive. I whispered something to the mirror. I don't even know what it was. It wasn't words exactly. Just breathe. Just being. And the mirror, it didn't reply. But it didn't need to. After another long pause, I stepped away. I didn't want to, but I did. I passed a strange timepiece shaped like an open book. The hands sat across its 2 pages like quills. They ticked so faintly I had to hold my breath to hear them. I reached the doorway again. The same curtain, now still behind me. I turned back once just to glance at the mirror. It hadn't moved. Neither had I, really. And then I passed through the velvet once more. The clocks beyond welcomed me back with soft, ticking voices. Each one right, each one wrong, each one perfectly itself. The clocks were louder when I returned. Not dramatically so, just a bit more insistent. Like they had noticed my absence and, in their own quiet way, wanted to be sure I knew they were still there. Still ticking, still keeping their time even if I wasn't. I walked slowly, letting the familiar rhythm wrap around me once more. Tick, tick, tick. Tock, tick, tick, tick. No 2 sounds matched, yet it was harmony. It was then that I smelled something unexpected. Warm, earthy, welcoming. Tea. Tucked in a little nook behind a tall cabinet, I found it. A small table, barely larger than a footstool. Crooked, uneven, its legs mismatched like they had been scavenged from different lives. On top sat a blackened iron kettle. Its surface was dulled by age, but its shape was familiar, rounded, purposeful. Steam curled slowly from the spout in a thin ribbon that danced in the dusty light. Beside it, a single ceramic mug, cracked near the rim, painted with a blue flower that had long since faded to gray. No note, no explanation, just there, waiting. I hesitated. Not because I feared it, but because it felt like the kind of thing you weren't supposed to disturb. Like a still pond, like a quiet thought you didn't want to interrupt. But the kettle was warm, the mug was clean, and something in the air whispered, yes. So I poured. The tea was a pale golden color, clear with the faintest swirl of something floral. Chamomile, I thought. Maybe a hint of thyme. There was a sweetness to it too. Not sugar, something more like honey that had forgotten it was supposed to be sweet. I held the cup in both hands. It was warm, but not hot. Comfortably so. The kind of warmth you feel on a winter morning when the sun hits just one corner of your blanket. There wasn't a chair nearby, so I didn't sit. I simply leaned against the cabinet and stared into the mug. The steam rose slowly, curling into soft spirals before fading into nothing. The clocks ticked all around me, but more softly now, as though they too were pausing, listening. There was a round-faced clock on the wall opposite me. Plain, wooden, quiet. It ticked with the rhythm of breath. In, out, in, out. I watched the minute hand shift, just slightly. Just enough. I thought about who had made the tea, who had poured the water, who had left it here, this little act of kindness, this pause in the afternoon. Maybe it was meant for me, maybe it wasn't, but in that moment, it was mine. I sipped slowly. The warmth spread from my mouth to my throat, then into my chest. I could feel it pool just beneath my collarbone, like a soft light flickering behind skin. And the clocks kept ticking. Each sip was a step. Each pause between was a breath. Each breath was a moment. And the moment didn't ask me to do anything with it. It just wanted to be. I let the last of the tea linger on my tongue before I swallowed. Then I gently placed the mug back on the table. It made a small clink. Final. Polite. I stood a moment longer, hands empty now, but still warm. The ticking hadn't changed. The room hadn't changed. But something in me had softened. I smiled. Only slightly, barely enough to notice. Then I walked on, deeper into the sound. Not every clock ticked. That shouldn't have surprised me by now, but it still did. I'd grown so used to the sound, so used to being surrounded by it, that the absence of ticking felt louder than ticking ever had. I found it tucked beneath a low shelf, half hidden, as if it preferred to be overlooked. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, with a face covered by cloudy glass and hands that hadn't moved in who knows how long. The wood was dark, heavy, carved with swirling vines and tiny flowers, though many of the details had worn down to smooth suggestions over the years. A tiny brass key sat neatly on top, resting there like it had always belonged. I crouched beside it. The floor creaked faintly beneath me, not in protest, just acknowledgement. Up close, the clock looked even older. There was a little crack along the bottom where the wood had dried out and pulled away. The numerals were faint. Roman, I think, though some had vanished completely, rubbed away by time or fingers or both. And the hands, they were frozen between 4 and 5, pointing at nothing in particular. I didn't touch it, didn't try to wind it, didn't try to fix it. It didn't need fixing. It had already done its job. Maybe for decades, maybe for centuries, and now it was simply resting. I thought about what it might have seen. A fireplace, a wedding, children growing up and moving out and coming back with their own children. It might have once sat on a mantel. It might have marked the hours with a proud little bell. Ding, ding, ding. I imagined someone dusting it every morning, straightening it slightly, checking it out of habit even when they already knew the time. I wondered what the last thing it timed was, the final moment before it stopped. Maybe someone walked out the door and didn't come back. Maybe someone sat in front of it and whispered, "Enough." Or maybe it stopped during a nap, a long, quiet nap. I leaned forward until my nose was just inches from the glass. I listened. No ticking, but not silence either. It was the silence after music, the silence inside memory, the kind that hums. I closed my eyes, let my breath match its stillness, let my thoughts settle one by one until even they were quiet. And then, with a soft motion, I bowed. Not out of reverence, not even respect, but something simpler. Recognition. Not everything that's quiet is empty. Not everything that stops is broken. I stood slowly, knees stiff from crouching. The clocks around me kept on, ticking, talking, humming, breathing. But that one, that small, still clock beneath the shelf, stayed, unmoving, unbothered. unchanging, perfect. It was barely there. I found it when I wasn't looking, just turning a corner near a crooked windowsill where the light dripped down in slanted lines and gathered quietly in the corners of the room. The curtain over the window was thin, green velvet like the one I'd passed through earlier, but faded to the color of moss left out in winter. It moved just slightly, as if it breathed, and behind that curtain, perched quietly on the sill, was a small glass jar. At first I thought it was empty. Then I saw the glint, a flicker of gold, a shape that didn't quite stay still, a clock. No bigger than the tip of my finger. It was curled at the bottom of the jar like a sleeping insect, delicate, almost impossibly small. Its case was rounded, its dial the size of a seed. 2 tiny hands moved gently over its surface, measured, sure, quiet. It was ticking. Tick. Wait. Tick. Wait. It wasn't the kind of ticking you noticed with your ears. It was the kind you noticed with your skin, with your attention. I leaned closer, fogged the glass just a little, let my breath bounce softly off the surface. The jar had a cork lid tied with a faded bit of string, and hanging from that string was a tag. A tiny square of paper gone almost completely yellow with age. There were words written on it, I think, but I couldn't read them. Maybe they'd faded. Maybe they'd never been there. I didn't open the jar. I didn't even think to try. The smallest clock felt too complete as it was, sealed inside its tiny world, measuring something I couldn't see and wasn't meant to. What was it ticking for? A thought? A wish? The space between 2 deep breaths? Maybe it was keeping time for something that didn't happen yet, or had already happened and was still echoing softly across the years. I sat beside the window and looked at it for a long time. Outside, the sky had gone from gold to gray-blue, the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself, just arrives, calmly, like a guest who knows they're always welcome. There were no people outside, no carts, no bells. Just the stillness of Prague settling into its evening coat, and inside, this smallest clock continued to tick. Not for the shop, not for me, not for anything I could name. Just ticking because that's what it did. A clock doesn't ask questions. It just moves forward or it stops. This one moved, and that was enough. Eventually, I stood. My knees cracked softly, like dry wood shifting in a floorboard. I looked once more into the jar. I whispered, without thinking, "Thank you," and walked on. It was tucked behind the counter, not locked away, not hidden, just placed there, quietly, deliberately, like something you use every day until one day you don't. The counter itself wasn't really a counter at all. It was a workbench, a long, scarred slab of wood covered in soft indentations and faded rings where cups of tea had once been set down and forgotten. Dust had settled in the grooves, but not deeply. It hadn't been long. And there, in the middle of it all, lay the book, large, leather-bound, slightly bowed from years of opening and closing. Its corners were worn to the cloth beneath, and one side of the spine had been rubbed smooth by the brush of a palm, over and over again, in the same place, by the same hand. It was already open. I approached slowly. There was no rush in this place. No expectation, only time, and how you choose to spend it. The pages were thick, yellowed with age. The ink faded to the soft color of old tea. The handwriting was beautiful. I don't often think of handwriting that way, but this was. Looped and curved, even and patient, each letter holding its shape like it had been taught properly. And the entries, they weren't what I expected. They weren't serial numbers or repairs or prices. They were stories, tiny ones, just a few words each. But each one carried weight. Found in a Paris attic, still rings on anniversaries. Brought back from the war, keeps 2 different times. Ran 10 minutes fast for 30 years, finally learned to rest. There was one that simply said, ticked until the last breath, and a little after. I turned a page. Carefully, the paper whispered as it moved. The next entries were just as strange, just as lovely. Chimes only at dawn. Skips a second when someone lies nearby. Silence for 40 years, then a soft click when her name is spoken. I don't know who wrote them, the clockmaker, I suppose. Or maybe someone else entirely. Maybe the clocks themselves dictated their stories and the hand just followed along. I reached the final page. Most of it was blank, just 1 or 2 lines filled. The last entry read, no longer runs, but still listens. I rested my fingers on that line for a long time. There was something about it, something true in a way I couldn't explain. The idea of a clock that listened, that heard time instead of measuring it. I closed my eyes. Let the ticking rise around me again. Let the words sink into the still space just behind my thoughts. When I opened my eyes, I noticed something else. At the bottom of the page, one last blank line. Waiting. Empty. Ready. I didn't write anything, didn't even pick up the pen that lay nearby, but I imagined what it might say if it were mine. Traveler, stopped in, listened, sat still a while, moved on. Maybe someday someone would write it. Maybe it would stay blank forever. Either way, the ledger would still be here. Waiting, remembering, listening. It happened slowly, not all at once. There wasn't a bell, no final chime, no voice telling me it was time to go. Just a feeling, a slight shift in the air, a cooling, a quiet hush settling over everything, like the moment when snowfall pauses mid-air. I stood near the counter, hand still resting gently on the cover of the ledger, and looked around. The clocks were still ticking. Of course they were. They always would be. But now they seemed content to carry on without me. I wandered back through the familiar paths, past the curtain, past the tea kettle, now cold but still there. The mug had a ring at the bottom, a perfect soft brown circle left behind like a quiet memory. The velvet chair waited by the window, its cushions slightly more creased than before. I brushed my hand across the armrest as I passed, a soft farewell to the place that had held me for longer than I could say. The rabbit stain on the ceiling still watched from its corner, ears slightly drooped, eyes as confused as ever. I gave him a small wave. Goodbye, Gerald. I didn't want to leave. Not really. But I knew I would. Not because I was finished, but because the moment was. And some moments, they don't need a reason to end. They just quietly fold themselves closed. The front door stood just as I had left it, oxblood red, its brass handle still cool, still smooth. I paused with my hand on it, turned back one last time. The shop was just as I had found it. Dust in the light, clocks arguing politely, shadows stretched long across the floor. It hadn't changed, but I had, just a little. I pushed open the door. It sighed again, tired, familiar, unconcerned. Outside, the light had gone pale and blue at the edges. Evening was waiting just around the corners of buildings. The cobblestones were cool underfoot. The city, quiet, not silent, just softened. Like the volume had been turned down, gently. I took one step out, then another, and I stopped. Reached into my coat pocket and felt something small and round. It wasn't there before. Or maybe it always had been. A stone, I think. Smooth, worn, warm from my palm. I turned it over once, twice. There was nothing on it. No mark, no symbol. But it was important. I looked down the street. It curved slightly out of view, disappearing into a soft fog. I couldn't see where it led. Didn't need to, because that's how it always goes. One place leads to another, not in a straight line, not in any order. Just forward. Maybe. I stood for a moment longer, breathing in the city, the quiet, the ticking still echoing faintly behind the door. Or maybe just inside me. I didn't know where I was going. Not yet, not this time. Maybe a long train ride with no destination. Maybe a windmill, a staircase, a hill where goats used to graze, a harbor filled with empty crates, a sky with too many stars. Maybe I'd end up in a castle made entirely of glass, or a diner in 1943, or a library that only carried one book. Wherever it was, I wouldn't plan it, wouldn't expect it. I would just be there. When the time was right, when the stone in my hand decided to hum, because that's how I travel. Softly, quietly, without maps. I slipped the stone back into my pocket, turned away from the door, and with my coat pulled tighter around me, I started walking. Somewhere, somewhen, but not yet. Soon.